Welcome back to the Code Ryan podcast. Today I have on Bobby Stearman, and he's joining me today to discuss the Django REST Framework. But before we kind of get to some kind of key takeaways and nice overview points on that, Bobby, could you kind of give me just a brief background on yourself as it relates to kind of software engineering and your kind of development career?
Yeah, sure thing. So, I'm Bobby Stearman. I'm a software engineer. So I'm a self-taught software engineer. I like to get that out there straight away. I've been doing this now for more or less 10 years. Specialize in Python, Django, and Django REST Framework projects through my company called Did Coding. And also on top of the Did Coding company, the software engineering, the freelancing stuff I do there, I also run a YouTube channel called Did Coding, where I create some easy to follow tutorials for Python courses, Django, things like that, right? So, and I also run another company called Odyssey, which is a Web3 project focusing on NFTs and, which is based on a Hedera network as well. So, yeah, I've got a lot going on.
Awesome. Yeah, it definitely sounds like you have plenty going on here. Well, I think that kind of gives a nice little background on yourself here to kind of set some context for this discussion here. So the place I'd like to take this is kind of for the Django REST framework. And personally, I tend to focus more on React, JavaScript, and the front end. But so this is going to be a super selfish podcast for me, because for work, we actually use Django REST framework as kind of the link between our database and the front end. So I kind of dabble in there a little bit, but definitely could use a better understanding of how things work. So hopefully people listening will also get an idea of that, even if they are a little more front end focused. So I think a good place for us to start here, Bobby, is like, what even is the Django REST framework? Like, people may have heard of Django, but what's this like REST framework thing? Is it different than Django, or kind of how does that work?
Okay, yeah. So a lot of people would have heard of Django. I use it in most of my projects, and lo and behold, I also use DRF as well. So Django REST Framework, right? So it's a very, very popular, powerful, and flexible Django toolkit. So it's a package that you work alongside Django that allows us to build web APIs. Okay, so just a standard URL endpoint where you can make a request to a server and get a response, or equally, you can tie it up with a single page application front end such as React or Vue, and they work very, very well together. So you'll be hard pushed to find a very modern project that hasn't got some Django REST framework in a Django project, because the toolkit is vast, and it's not just all about endpoints. There's a whole bunch of things that you can utilize it for.
Gotcha. And that kind of leads me right into the next question of, why would someone decide to use Django REST Framework? Like, what are some of those things that people can do that are kind of powerful that you mentioned there that make it something that's like so popular as it is and so easy to use?
Yeah, well, I mean, like I say, it is really, really popular. And like Django, is batteries included, right? So it's vast. And the idea of Django itself is that you can build a web application in a matter of minutes. And so it's taken that ethos and kind of lent it towards REST APIs and web APIs. So like Django, one of the very, very big sort of plus points ticking boxes is that it allows you to create a web API very, very quickly, and removes a lot of the handles a lot of the boilerplate stuff, so you haven't got to worry about that and reinvent the wheel. So, I mean, there's other REST APIs that you can use alongside Django. So we've got Django TastyPie, Django Restless, Django JSON View, to name a few. I don't use them. It's one of those, when you get used to, for instance, web frameworks, I almost exclusively use Django, right? Because I'm a Python developer, do a lot of web app stuff, web development, and there's a lot of frameworks, and I find Django has just got all of the tools I could possibly need to get things done quickly. Same as Django REST Framework. So it's vast. The documentation is second to none. The ecosystem for Django and Django REST Framework is, again, second to none. It's really, really good. Do you have any questions? Stack Overflow, you've got the answer. Another alternative would be Fast API, which is a Python framework that allows you to create APIs also. It's very, very fast. It's lightweight. And there's use cases where Fast API is a great option, and it is, they're both fantastic. I tend to use Django REST Framework because the projects I work on normally lend weight to something that's more robust and scalable.
And with that, can you use Django REST Framework with like other frameworks? Like, could someone potentially use Django REST Framework with like a React app or something like that, just to have as kind of like their API layer there? Or is it pretty tied to using the entire Django web framework?
See, I've never used it with anything other than Django web framework, right? So I honestly, I don't know. I've read articles that would suggest that you can, albeit in Django, there's quite a lot of steps that you need to follow for you to even use Django REST Framework. So you need to install a package first and foremost, add a whole bunch of settings, and it's highly customizable for Django. That being said, things like the serializers, I believe you could use them in other projects because it is all Python, right? So it's all about inherency and kind of just implementing it in your project. So I believe you can. I've never done it, but it is more or less tied to Django.
Gotcha. And I know that you definitely can, if you want to separate out your front end from, if you want to like write your front end in completely React or, I've specifically used React, so I guess I can't speak to Vue, but I'm guessing like other front end frameworks specifically, you can use those with like Django REST Framework and Django as well. You don't necessarily need to do like necessarily everything with kind of the Django web framework. Does that sound correct?
Yeah, no, that's about it. So, I mean, at the end of the day, with a single page application, really all you need to link it to the endpoints, right? So, providing you've got the domain in which you're pointing towards from the front single page application, and that could be, like you say, React, Vue, Svelte is one I'm seeing a bit of these days as well. You just need to get the settings set up correctly in the single page application, and you're good to go.
Well, I think that provides a good kind of overview of what it is. Now, one kind of term that we've been throwing out here a little bit is API endpoints. And just to kind of peel back a little bit, what are we even talking about when we say API endpoint?
Okay, so think of the endpoint as the touch point, right? So this is where a user or the single page application or the user of the SDK or API, in fact, would make a request. So the API takes a HTTP request. So we've got a get, put, post, delete, right? So the endpoint is quite literally a URL that manages that service. So you make a request to that URL, it makes a request to the service, and it receives a response. That's quite simply what it is. It is the way into the API. It's the touch point.
And that kind of brings us back to the definition of API, application programmer interface. That API is the interface that is your touch point, like you said, to kind of communicate between kind of like two different programs.
That's right. And I mentioned SDK there as well. So a software developer kit. So sometimes these APIs can get complex, right? So, and in which case, the client will create a software developer kit, so an interface between the API and the end user to allow them to integrate into the API. Stripe, for instance, is a good example of a really fantastic SDK, because if you were to make requests manually using curl or HTTP or something like that, it's a little bit more difficult to actually make the request with authentication and tokens, and so the SDK makes it far more simpler to integrate an API into your product.
Maybe now to transition into maybe not super technical, but a little bit more into kind of the steps that someone would take in the Django REST framework to actually create one of these endpoints. So say that they like have a database of users and they just want to kind of hit an endpoint to check if this user exists in their database. What might be the steps that someone would have to go through to kind of create just this endpoint to do this?
Yeah, okay. So you would need a Django project, right? So Django has some fantastic documentation. There's a tutorial on their website that allows you to create a project within minutes. It really is quick. Providing you've got Python locally, it's a case of creating a project. So you basically install Django, you create a project, and you're up and running. It's really, really quick. And I would urge you to have a look at the documentation. Likewise, Django REST Framework, their documentation is second to none as well. It really is good. So whenever I'm building a Django application, a Django project, or a Django REST Framework app or project, I kind of always follow the same steps. So you're talking about a URL. How do we create that endpoint, right? Well, that's kind of the last step. I always start with the installation of packages. So you'll be installing Django, getting a project up and running. You then install Django REST Framework, and that's really the only packages you need for this instance. Follow the tutorials online. It shows you how to set up the settings and things. There's some very, very basic settings. Copy, paste, you're good. You then want to start looking into data. So models. You're talking about a request to an endpoint, a service. Make the request, get the response. In this case, we're talking about kind of user details. So we need somewhere to store those user details, which would be a database. In Django, the terminology is a model. So a model is kind of a definitive representation of a database table. So you'll have a whole bunch of models. All of them are linked or representation of an actual database table. Okay, so we'll start with my models. I then move on to, in Django world, it will be forms. In Django REST Framework, it will be serializers. So serializers effectively take data from the database, serialize it in a format, so Python data types, which can easily be rendered into the API response. Okay, so it's models, serializers. We then start looking at views, which are basically functions, Python functions that handle the request response logic. And lastly, we wire all of that up to what we would call a URL or a router. And that would effectively be the endpoint that you make the request to. So from the top, it would be install packages, models, serializers, views, URLs. And if you follow the tutorials, you can get a very basic API up and running in, I would say, under 15 minutes. If you understand Python and a little bit of Django knowledge.
So if I'm understanding this correctly, and forgive me for being a stupid front-end developer, but my understanding is that, so like you said, you first have to do like some basic installation. I think most developers are probably familiar with that, like even just creating a React front end.
Yeah.
You're going to have to install React and stuff like that. So you kind of have to do that installation, install some settings, stuff like that. But the docs are a great place to consult for that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And then once you do that, then you start looking at the model, and that model is basically going to be like kind of represent a table in your database.
That's right.
Does that sound correct?
That's right. Yeah.
Gotcha. So in that model, you can maybe set up the different, like say you had several different fields in your table of your database, you could set that up in the model.
Indeed.
Gotcha. And then that model, how does that work with the serializer? So say they hit this endpoint and it's connected to a certain model, then while it's getting that data to send back, it passes through the serializer?
Yeah, that's right. So indeed it does. Yeah. So the serializer, so you've got a whole bunch of different data types, integers, floats, you've got strings and date types and all sorts of stuff. So what the serializer is really good at is taking this model representation and serializing it into a common format that can be rendered into the API response. So when I say that, I mean JSON, right? So it's a representation of that model that gets sent back to the API user in a response. So if we're talking about a user, it might return a first name, last name, gender, date of birth, right? So we've got a string, what would be an enum, and a date field, right? So it would serialize that in straight out of the box. There's model serializers that are kind of wired up directly to models, highly customizable, but straight out of the box, they kind of the basic logic's already there. But yeah, the serializer that works in between the view and the model to make a common the sort of Python data types that the JSON representation can handle.
Gotcha. And for that serializer, you mentioned they're highly customizable.
Yeah.
So like, is the serializer something that you specifically write, or do you just use like a default serializer from the Django REST framework? Or like you said, do you kind of, maybe you can override it and extend it to customize it more, or how does that kind of work?
Yeah, you can. So like with Django and Django REST Framework, there's 101 ways to skin a cat. And, you can, in some instances in Django, you can get a view wired up with one line of code embedded within the URL. You can go further and you can customize that in the view itself and extend it. And then you overwrite things like the get request, the post request, the get object logic. Same with the serializers. The straight out of the box serializer is called let's call it a model serializer. You can create a model serializer which inherits from the DRF serializer app, and then you can quite literally return every field in the model itself. So in the meta, you would just put all, or you can then define what gets returned. So some models might have 15, 20, 30 different fields, right? Capturing all loads of booleans and true falses and all sorts of stuff. You might not want to send that back to the end user. You might just want to be sending the first name, last name, is active, that type of thing. And that's when you would start really honing in on the serializer and altering it to your use case. But it's if you know Python, it's very easy to do. It is a case of just inherency from the abstract class, and then overwriting certain metadata and overwriting certain class functions, class methods.
Absolutely. So in that serializer, so an example from our kind of production app is we were kind of returning a bunch of survey data to the front end. And with that, we were, in some of our requests, we were sending like a bunch of different survey JSON and just way too much data, and it was slowing down our network requests and slowing down our app. So one of the tasks was to kind of go in there and to only return the data that's needed. So it sounds like in that serializer, you can specify what fields you actually want to return to the front end when you hit that endpoint. So the serializer kind of has, is that the sort of logic that kind of goes in the serializer?
Indeed, it's doing it. Like with Django Forms, if any of the viewers here are familiar with Django, Forms do a lot of work. They do a lot of heavy lifting. They really do. A lot of the logic on validation, pagination and things like that can be done in the Forms. Same as serializers. So you can do a lot of validation. You can, like I say, you can just serialize models. You can do a lot of pagination as well. You can do next page tokenization. There's a lot of stuff that's already built into Django REST Framework. It's something that you need to create or reinvent the wheel. You can quite literally inherit from the application that's already there. So yeah, the serializer is really doing a big chunk of the work. And that's why Django REST Framework is quite powerful. If you read online some of the articles, that's one of the top points that makes Django REST Framework a real good, solid option for you.
Gotcha. So I think that provides kind of a good overview of serializers. And I know, like, just for me personally, one thing that I still struggle with a little bit is like what logic to put in the serializer versus in like the view. So you kind of have your model to where you have your just your table for your database. And then, like you said, it kind of goes through the serializer, but then you also have these view functions to where you could also do some logic. So like what should I know about like where to do what logic, or does it just like kind of depend and it's like many ways to kind of skin a cat, or what's kind of your thought process on that?
Normally, we like to have, in the Django world, we like to have what we call thin views and fat models. So the views, try not to keep the logic in the view. There's going to be some logic. Of course, there's going to be some logic in the view. You've got get, post, put, request, and all sorts. But most of the logic specific to the model is normally kept within the model, and you construct class methods. You can create static methods, properties, and all sorts. You can have really long, vast models, and that's where most of the logic should be. However, the serializer logic, we kind of normally keep data validation, so and exceptions and things like that in the serializer. That's the best place to put it, and it handles what gets sent back to the user as well. So, for instance, if you're just doing a get request or a get list or what have you, there's not much validation going on. But if you're actually doing a post request or a put request, you're sending data to the service, to the endpoint, and at which point you need to make sure that the data coming in is of the data type that we're expecting when we're translating it to the field in the model. So date time fields are one of my biggest pet hates because there's so many different formats and you've got time zones. So you need to make sure that what is coming in is what's expected. So that's where you do all of validation, and that's where you handle all the exceptions and things like that. So if, for instance, a user was to send in the wrong type of date format, you want to make sure that the exception that goes back to the user is clear, concise, and prescriptive, right? So you need to, the user then understands that the next request they make is, the date format is of the correct type. So that's where, in answer to your question, that's where the logic should be. So if it's about data and data validation, sits within the serializer. If it's about the model itself, so if we're talking about a user model, actually I'll come back to this as well. But the user model is where we're capturing information specific about the user. So it'd be the first name, last name, and everything else. It could be age, weight, height, ethnicity, all this sort of stuff. Logic about that user, such as calculate age, return full name. That's the sort of logic that sits within the model itself. And you shouldn't be doing that kind of logic in the view. Right back circle to the user model. Actually, Django comes with a really powerful authentication application. So it comes with a user model already built into it. So you don't need to build that user model. You inherit from it. So actually, to fire up a Django app, if we're just talking about a user model, you don't need to create a model at all. You just need to point it towards the user model that's already built inside Django.
Perfect. That honestly clears a lot of things up for me. Cause being a front-end developer, just like going into a Django REST Framework application raw, it's like, all right, there's some logic in the view, there's some logic in the serializer, there's some logic in the model. And it's just like, I don't know what to do here. Like it is a little tricky.
There are cases where you can just use, Django has a whole bunch of generic views, as does DRF. So built-in views that need very little customization. And when developers use those, it can be very difficult for somebody who's completely green, brand spanking new to Django to understand what's going on, because the logic within those views is held within an environment, a virtual environment, right? So you don't necessarily have direct access to the code unless you know where to look. But it depends what type of developer you are. It depends how experienced you are. I sometimes put logic in a view just because it might be easier for me at the time. And then I'll refactor a little bit later on when I understand things are working correctly as expected. And I might then just sort of sharpen my pencil and have another run up.
Awesome. Well, I think that gives a really good overview of views, models, and serializers. But if we could just hit on one more thing here that I definitely had a hard time with when starting out, and that is migrations. So in Django, it has this idea of migrations, and I remember my engineering manager coming to me like, I would change something in a field, and he'd be like, all right, you have to create a new migration for that. I'd just be like, what? What's that mean? And he would kind of explain it, and then we'd have like migration conflicts and stuff and different things like that. So like, what is a migration? How does someone create a migration? Why might someone need to create a migration? What are these like migration things?
Okay, so a model is a representation of a database table, right? So as we know, now look at the user model. We inherit from Django's user model, and we might want some specific fields for the project we're working on. We're talking about ethnicity, and you could have a whole bunch of enums, whatever the case may be. We would inherit from them. Now, when we first fire up Django, if you follow the tutorial, it will ask you to run a certain command, which is Python manage.py make migrations, followed by Python manage.py migrate. Two different commands. Now, one of them essentially stages the fields into a Python file, which then gets stored within the project in a certain sort of directory format. And what you're doing by running that command is taking all of the models and it's writing some scripts around what the fields should look like. And it could be read-only. The field could be an integer field with a default of 1. It can be blank. It can be null. It might be read-only, whatever the case may be. However the model is constructed, that gets written into a migration file. Now you can run the make migrations over and over and over and over as you're working on a, from a day-to-day basis. You might not necessarily want to push those to the database until the end of the week or whatever the case may be. That's when you migrate. As soon as you migrate those migration files, database tables are created, fields are altered, fields are created. But Django will handle that process and create those database tables and columns and what have you. And you can use a whole bunch of different types of SQL tables. So built in, it uses SQLite 3, whatever the case, I forget what it's called now. But you can use PostgreSQL, MySQL. There's a whole bunch of different options, but Django handles that for you. So essentially, you stage the changes, then you push the changes. Similar to Git in the way you'd make a commit and then a push, right?
Perfect. So when updating your models and like adding new fields, different things like that, you can create what's called a migration to kind of set the changes, and then calling the migrate command will like go back to your Git analogy, will push those changes and actually make those like live changes.
Yeah, you can get cute with the make migrations. You can migrate certain files. You haven't got to do all of them at once. You can migrate a certain application. You can migrate a certain PY file, a specific file. But Django makes it so easy to do all of that.
And you can also, if I'm correct, kind of roll back migrations.
Yeah, you can. When things go well, they go very, very well. But when you have a problem with migrations, you've got to roll your sleeves up. It can take some doing. In development, it's fine, right? You can almost wipe slate clean, delete your migration files and start again. But if you start, for instance, there's been an occasion where I wanted to change the database type. So I was using Postgres and I wanted to use a GIS, Postgres GIS, right? So in doing so, the schema had needed to change. And in doing so, it meant that some fields that are accessible in Postgres straight out of the box needed to be changed for the other version, in which case all my migration files were messed up. And it's when it goes well, it goes well. When it doesn't, then it takes some tweaking. But I hope that you guys out there don't have too many issues.
I mean, I haven't had a terrible amount of issues, but I've definitely been into the migration pit of trying to figure out things happening. It's very similar to like the Git pit, to where like if you're trying to like rebase and then go back through different commits and stuff, like it's brutal.
It can be difficult. Just take it one step at a time. Take it, have a break, have a coffee, come back. But in development all day long, it's not an issue. It's just when you start pushing the staging and production, and if you've got a conflict, then it could go horribly wrong. But once you understand how it works and why we do it in a certain way, same as Git, once you really understand it, it starts kind of demystifying and becomes a little bit easier, right? So
awesome. Well, I think we're coming up on time here, Bobby. Thank you so much for joining me. If you could just remind people on where to find your YouTube channel and where to find kind of your other projects that you're working on here.
Yeah, sure. So my YouTube channel is Did Coding. Like I say, I do a lot of, that's DID coding. DID stands for Dumb It Down. So Did Coding, I do a lot of easy to follow tutorials on Django REST Framework, Python, and I do a lot of Web3 stuff. So my website is didcoding.com. We're going for a bit of an upgrade as we speak, so don't judge me on the design. And the other website will be odyssey.com. That will be launched in the next 2 or 3 months, and that is all about Web3 NFTs and land acquisitions via NFC. So it should be an interesting one.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming on today.
Yeah, no worries at all. Thanks for having me.